Mohammed and others have asked me to give a brief overview of the election in Somalia, where things stand, how we got here. What I would like to do is to keep my remarks relatively brief so that you have plenty of time to ask questions if that's what you want to do. Let me try to contextualize the elections, why we are here, how we got here, and how we go from here. In 2016, when the election for the current president and the ending of the mandate of the former president was ending, a commitment was made that in the next election, which is 2020, a universal suffrage or one person, one vote election would be implemented in Somalia. This was a cop-out because it was a testament to the failure of the Somali political class not to advance the political agenda very far. There was a commitment even before that, in 22 Alif, that one person, one vote would be held in 2016. And when it became very clear that the infrastructure and the support network and the institutions were not in place for a one person, one vote universal suffrage election, the political class all copped out with a commitment to hold one person, one vote elections in 2020. Basically, you know, as the cliche is, to kick the can down the road. With that, President Farmajo was elected. There was a lot of euphoria, and the expectation was now the environment was set, and the stars were aligned for a possible one person, one vote in 2020. Because of that commitment and because of the enthusiasm linked to the election of President Farmajo, a lot of investment was made by different stakeholders in preparation for the 2020 election. Political parties, civil society, the government itself, the federal government, the federal member states, all were looking forward to the 2020 election as a one person, one vote universal suffrage election. This was, let's say, encoded in an agreement between the federal government and the federal member states in Baidoa in 2018, in June, I believe it was. But a lot of things were supposed to have been done in the run-up to the elections, meaning a lot of preparatory work on the field, especially on security, on enfranchisement, on voter education, on the legal legislative aspect, the election law, the boundaries law, and so on and so forth. So many things were supposed to have been done. But 2018 and much of 2019 was wasted, I can say wasted, on recriminations and difficulties between the federal government and the federal member states. And finally, things came to head in June of this year, when the federal member states, who were already having other issues vis-a-vis the federal government on power sharing, on resource sharing, on security collaboration and other issues, and who have not met for 1 year and some months, finally decided to meet on their own without the participation or support or even acquiescence of the federal government in Samareb. And from that meeting, the federal member states looked themselves up, looked in the mirror and said, listen, we are where we are. We were supposed to have done all these things. Us and the federal government, we didn't do it. And we are where we are. So what do we do? And we came up to the conclusion that, in fact, with all the problems and with all the disappointments that this would entail, we could not, in good faith, tell the people that a one person, one vote universal suffrage election would be held in 2020. Subsequent meetings reaffirmed that position, and finally in Mogadishu in September, This agreement was ratified by the parliament, and we went back to the 2016 model. It is very well known that the president and his party, even if it does not exist on paper, his supporters, his group, was very much for one person, one vote election. The president has invested a lot of effort and energy in convincing himself and his supporters that, in fact, that was the best thing for himself and for Somalia. And he went to great lengths to try to convince the federal member states to come to his position, but that was not meant to be. Now, as soon as the federal member states went back to their respective regions, reality struck. In a country where institutions are weak and where oversight, especially by a constitutional court, is not there, all agreements, all political agreements that have constitutional implications depend a lot on goodwill. And very soon it became very clear that goodwill was still in short supply. And many stakeholders, including some of the federal member states, much of the opposition, the civil society, and others, decided to pick at this agreement and point to some defects that have come out in its implementation. Three main issues have come afore, and it has been reiterated. If you have been watching the international community's meeting with the Somali government at the Somali Partnership Forum today in Mogadishu, the main contentious issues are this. One, elections are not about just voting. You have to have a conducive environment. You have to have a feeling of independence, transparency, co-ownership, consensus among all the political stakeholders on the rules of the game. That by definition is a subjective assessment. So many stakeholders, including some federal member states, clearly came out against the new electoral committee as has been put together by the federal government and the federal member states. Another contentious issue, of course, is the sizable, and this is the price in the coming election, in my opinion, on the Somaliland delegation in parliament and in the lower house and in the Senate will be around almost 60 votes. How this delegation will be selected, who is in charge, who oversees it, and so on and so forth. Of course, in the agreement, in the technical agreement, it was decided with all supporting this position that the Prime Minister, the government, the executive branch would select or would oversee the process of selection for this delegation. The Speaker of the Senate, who hails from Somaliland and who is the most senior public official in the Somali government, Honorable Abdi Hashi, came out against it, even though he was party to the previous agreements and has co-ratified with the Speaker of the lower house the agreement that has been reached in Mogadishu. So this is now another contentious issue. Finally, the location of the polling places has been demarcated as 2 polling stations per federal member state. In almost all the other member states, there is no controversy on that. But in Jubaland, because of the legacy of conflict between the federal government and Jubaland, the selection of Garbahari as a polling station became contentious because, as you might know, and I'm sure all Somali listeners know this, Gedo region is now under the control of the federal government. Therefore, Jubaland maintains that violates the spirit and the letter of the agreement of Mogadishu, and unless Jubaland reverts back to the authority of Jubaland, as per the agreement, they will not be party to this election. So these are the contentious issues. What do we do now? How do we go from here? I think we need to realize that elections, without going into the outcomes and the process and so on, elections are very important for the health of the body politic of any country, especially in Somalia, where the state building process is not completed, how elections are conducted, whether they are fair, and more importantly, whether they are seen to be fair is very important. One might even ask the question, why hold elections anyway? What's the point? What's all the fuss? What's all the noise? This government or any government seems to be doing a fairly reasonable job. Why don't we let them continue? Why do we need elections in the first place? And really, if we answer this question honestly, we will realize why elections are not only important, but fair and free elections that are commonly owned are important. The first one is, of course, the message that it sends to young people, and we have talked about this a number of times in this forum, the message that it sends to young people that, in fact, each citizen of this country has a stake in the future and well-being and destiny of this country. And we don't have royalty, we don't have kingdoms, we are, a common citizenry. So any aspirant has as much right as the next person to say their piece into the affairs and destiny of the country. There is also a more practical consideration, in my opinion. Somalia is now emerging from conflict. We are having the triple whammy of COVID-19. We're having floods in some regions. We have locusts. One can say we have the perfect storm of all problems in the world. But our country is inherently rich. We have natural resources. We have marine resources. We have livestock resources. We have hydrocarbon resources. We have mineral resources. We have a vibrant and entrepreneurial population. By any stretch of the imagination, this country should be wealthy. This country should be an example to others. The international community collectively spends about $1 billion a year on assistance to Somalia. That has been going on for the last 30 years. That's 30 billion. What have we got to show for it? So we know that assistance aid is not going to make it. What we need to do is to get away from assistance and go into investment, trade. How do you do investment? If you are an investor who wants to invest in a long-term project, such as the hydrocarbon sector or the mineral sector, for example, or even in agriculture, you need stability and a clear vision that your investment, number one, will be protected, and number two, that it will bear fruit. Since these projects some of them take a decade or more for them to bear fruit before you get a return on your investment, you need stability. That stability does not come from individuals. That stability must come from institutions, from the rule of law, from inclusivity, from making sure that agreements of the current government will be respected by the subsequent governments. Any deal that is done, from a suitcase on this contract, it's not going to help Somalia or the investor. Therefore, how do you ensure that subsequent governments will honor contracts that are signed by the current government, for example? The only way to ensure that is to show that if this government will be re-elected, it will be re-elected cleanly, according to the rules, with the consent of everybody, that if you lose the election, you would concede honorably, that you would work with your predecessor, that you pledge to respect agreements signed by your predecessor, and so on and so forth. I personally say that one election is not enough. We need maybe a consecutive two consecutive elections. That's 8 years. That's good enough for most investors and for whether local or international to realize that we have stability. 3 successive elections are even better. By the time you reach 4 consecutive elections that are fair and free and owned by most of the population, and people will point out if you are a sore loser, they will be the first one to tell you you are a sore loser. We are all here. We know you lost fair and square. Therefore, that is why elections are important. The great majority of the Somali people, unfortunately, do not care who gets elected president. This is the tragedy of Somalia. Because they do not see any impact on their daily lives. Their attitude is, pox on them all. What difference does it make? And that culture can only be changed by clean elections, by efficient governments, by collaboration and working together of all political parties. And all sides have a role to play. The government, as the custodian of the infrastructure or the institutions, need to show that they are not using the levers of government to suppress, harass, intimidate opposition candidates. The opposition candidates also need to show that they are not, crying wolf every time some little problem happens, threatening violence, inciting people, creating a royal mess. That's not how we reach consensus. So we need to work on both sides to ensure that the temperature surrounding these elections are reduced. The indicators around these elections are not very good. There is a lot of noise among clans in social media. Even non-traditional indicators like price of weapons and ammunition rising in Mogadishu and in other urban areas reflects the concern that things are not well. And we all need to work together to make sure that we rectify the situation. What are the lessons learned from this exercise? The first lesson, I think, in my opinion, is not to delay elections or preparation for elections until the very last possible minute. This is what the previous government has done, and this is what this government has done. We have to stop what I would like to call, for lack of a better term, the injury time approach to electioneering, that you wait until the time is up and you only run around in the last couple of minutes to try to ensure you have an outcome. Whoever gets elected in the next election must work to have a universal suffrage, one person, one vote elections from day one. It can't wait in 2022, 2023, or even 2024. It has to start from the get-go. Maybe the government should appoint a minister on elections in the next government. Now it's under the Minister of Interior. It is that important. We need to get from this impasse and waiting until the last minute to wait for elections. The second lessons learned, as I said, is that democracy is not simply voting. You have to create an environment that is conducive to elections, giving space to civil society, to opposition candidates, to businessmen, people who are not interested in the election per se, but are interested because elections have an impact on their investments, on their wealth, on their lives. We have also to learn that in an election season, the government has government duties. The government cannot abandon its governing role. The opposition cannot expect the government to become just another opposition, another party, or the president to become another candidate. The job of governing must continue on policing, on security, on infrastructure, on other things. Therefore, that fine balance must be struck. The third point is the international community must take a more robust role to enforce best practices. Somalia is a member of a number of international bodies, starting from IGAD, the African Union, the United Nations. Membership of these organizations oblige us to follow certain rules and regulations that govern the world. Therefore, we cannot pretend that we are an island or a planet up in the universe. And the international community needs to come to Somalia and say loud and clear, we give you the space to work out on your problems, but at the end of the day, you are under obligation to respect this and this and this statute or treaty. And by the way, Somalia, as a conflict recovering country, is still under the United Nations Council Chapter 7 mandates on many aspects, meaning that every 3 months, the SRSG has to go to New York to give a briefing on Somalia, and so on and so forth. Therefore, the international community has a role to play in being a fair arbiter on the enforcement of best practices and call out without favor to anybody who is disturbing the peace in the country. Finally, we have to remember and remind ourselves. I started my speech saying that I started this as a private citizen. I was a public servant. We are all public servants. It's not about us. It's not what's good for me. It's what's good for this country. Sometimes politics in Somalia comes out like a game, winners and losers, my team, their team. Criminalizing dissent from the government side, from the opposition side, everything that the government does, whether it's good or bad, it's all bad. That culture has to change. The opposition must realize that, in fact, some good things are being done on a daily basis. And whoever comes to power, if it happens from the opposition, will owe this government a great deal of gratitude for having pushed the relay a little bit farther than it was in 2016. The government also needs to realize that we are all rivals, not enemies, and the public interest must precede that of the individual. I leave the elections at that. Mohammed and others have asked me to make a comment on the wider region, what's happening there in our neck of the woods. Let me start without being very verbose about it. When the Western powers divided Africa in the infamous Scramble of Africa in 1884, and divided Africa among themselves, many nations found themselves divided by these arbitrary lines. When I say nations, in many African countries, there were nations, indigenous nations that had their own social contract, rules and regulations, some of them with their kings, others with their elders, settling disputes, going on with life. Some of them well advanced in West Africa, in East Africa, in the Horn. But arbitrarily drawn lines divided these nations. And so when the OAU came to ratify the charter in 1963, they all realized, the elders all realized, that this is a Pandora's box. Let's leave things the way they are. Because if we go down that route, then the whole thing will disintegrate. And with the exception of Somalia, as we all learned in high school, this charter was ratified to leave African boundaries the way they are. But that never solved the real problem. In fact, a casual research, back of the envelope research, over 25 sets of boundary disputes among countries in Africa are still on the books that have not been resolved. The issue of South Sudan and that of Eritrea are the most recent examples of nations that decided to break away from the bigger body. Closer to home, our own Somaliland has declared to break off from Somalia and has in many respects done much better than the rest of Somalia over the last 30 years. But by and large, African boundaries, the way they are, existed and are still there. The new challenge, not new, but the big challenge, I would maintain, is now the opposite of that. It is how to hold these countries together now. And if you can't hold them together, then the obvious example is, again, Eritrea and South Sudan. But countries are having to deal with their internal dynamics. In Sudan, you all remember a couple of years back, the issue of Darfur. I mentioned Somalia. Many other countries with different successes, Angola, the Democratic Republic of Congo, are all struggling with how to maintain these sometimes huge countries unified. Those countries that navigate this new challenge will survive. Those countries that do not, and in many African countries, there are experimentations with different kinds of federalism, devolution, autonomous regions, all trying to come to grips with how to maintain these multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual countries. Because it's only a generation, maybe 2 generations ago, that many of these citizenry found themselves in these new countries and they had to pledge allegiance to a completely new flag, new country, new name, and so on and so forth. And those empires have not died. The successful countries in Africa are going to be the countries that manage internal dissent very well. Now, the issue in Ethiopia is very complicated, of course. It has all kinds of dynamics. But this new exercise has brought to fore silent voices that have been quiet for the last 30 years, harking back to a unified, strong Ethiopia, getting rid of the federalism that has been in place for the last 30 years. We have similar voices in Somalia, especially among the young people, especially on social media, that also want to get rid of this federalism. I'm not saying that federalism is a cure-all for all the problems that are there. But federalism in these countries and similar experiments, in Kenya, for example, they have what they call devolution, meaning even lower than federalism, devolving authority to the lowest county level. Federalism came about through blood and tears in many respects. And I assure you, it won't go away just because one politician or one political party wants so. If federalism is to go away, it will also go away through blood and tears. Therefore, the challenge for us all is how to navigate this treacherous path whereby we look out for the welfare of the citizenry and make